Good morning. Glad you're here this wet day, raining outside, but sure glad you could be with us. Certainly invite our visitors to come back and be with us anytime. This quarter in this class, we have been studying about David and Solomon. This is the last Sunday for the quarter, so we will finish up Solomon today, and we'll have a new teacher and a new subject next week. Today's lesson, if you want to be turning in your Bibles, is from 2 Chronicles chapter 9. 2 Chronicles chapter 9. That's where I'll be doing most of the reading today. It's where most of the lesson comes from. But if you want to make a note in your Bible or put a little sticky note or a little bookmark, we have a parallel passage in 1 Kings chapter 10. But we're going to be in Chronicles, but a related passage there is 1 Kings 10. We are looking at kind of the end of Solomon's reign. At the end of this chapter, he will pass away, but not before we are told of his extravagant fame, his riches beyond compare. So, because of his wisdom that God gave him, he is reflecting on man's purpose. And he cataloged all of these things that he found out with his great wisdom God gave him. He says in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 through 14, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. And I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. So in his search for what life was about and using his wisdom, he pursued wisdom. Talks about in verses 16 and 17. He pursued pleasure, he pursued possessions, and he pursued popularity. And we see all of his pursuits of these things as he is cataloging these things in the book of Ecclesiastes. But having obtained them all these things that he was seeking, he had obtained, he wrote, So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. So Solomon had grasped everything that life had to offer through his wisdom and through his exercise and pursuit of trying to find what life was all about. And he became famous as a part of all his efforts and because of all the blessings that God had given him. He was known throughout all of Israel for his wise judgment, and the people saw him that the wisdom of God was in him to administer the justice that he was administering to the kingdom. But his fame didn't stop just with Israel. It spread throughout all the world. During his time as king, see in 1 Kings chapter 4, God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. Because of this, men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth, who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So although Solomon's wisdom grew these great crowds, it wasn't the only reason he was known in his popularity and his fame. According to 1 Kings chapter 10, he also surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches. Providing a glimpse of his greatest wealth, Scripture states all King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. Can you imagine that just how abundant his blessings were and how even silver was counted as nothing? In one place it said it just counted as stones because there was so much of it. And because he had so much gold, everything, all the vessels that he had were made out of gold. In verse 27 in this chapter, it said, the king made silver common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in the lowland. So no wonder we see in the New Testament how Solomon is referred to being arrayed and how greatly he was arrayed in all his glory. So our lesson text in this particular chapter is going to describe the fame of Solomon, and it's going to go into great detail for his fame and more of his riches. So he's known far and wide and greatly admired by many because of it. So with that being said, Solomon's greatest achievement wasn't his fame, even though it continues today. It's a simple statement he provides at the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 12. He's summing up all these efforts to find out the meaning of life into these couple of verses. He says, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." So Solomon has made all this effort, and he boils it down in his wisdom of what he's found out, that fear God and keep his commandments. So that's really the meaning of life that he is imparting to us, and something we need to remember in even today. So let's start reading. We're going to start reading in this chapter, verses 1 through 6 in 2 Chronicles 9. If you'll follow along with me. Now, when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test him with hard questions, having a very great retinue and camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. There is nothing hidden from Solomon that he could not explain to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, and their clothing, his cupbearers and their clothing, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. And she said to the king, "The report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom, but I did not believe the reports until I came and in my own eyes had seen it. And behold, half the greatness of your wisdom was not told to me. You surpass the report that I heard." So one of the leaders that were of the time, Queen of Sheba, came to find out for herself, what was the extent of Solomon's wisdom, of his riches, of his glory. And to investigate the matter herself, she came to Jerusalem, and it says retinue is one of the, and then verse 1, who she came with. Does somebody else's version have another word other than retinue? Some versions say maybe entourage, all those people that are coming with her. She's coming with great pomp, with great, she's coming in with lots of people coming around her. So, it's just not her coming. She's bringing all these things to Solomon as she comes. And most people don't know where Sheba is. It's hotly debated whether Sheba as an area was at the end of Arabia, southern Arabia, where current-day Yemen is, or some people think it was across the Red Sea at Ethiopia. So some people think one side or the other. Some people suspect it may have been on both sides of the sea there because it's narrow, and that particular time they controlled both sides there. But most people, when you see referenced, is in southern Arabia, in Yemen, Now there's great debate again. Ethiopia lays claim to their having been Sheba. They're continuing to be a lasting dynasty through the Queen of Sheba. So they also, lay claim to her. But there's no really way to know for sure that of where Sheba was, because there's not really any more detail given than what we read in the Bible. But there's lots of legends. There's lots of other writings. But most people come down on that Sheba was on southern Arabia there, where Yemen is today. But with that being said, that's about 1,200 miles away from Jerusalem. So that explains why Jesus states she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. That was in Matthew chapter 12. But importantly, her caravan included camels loaded with resources from her country. She brought spices, gold in abundance, precious stones. Most likely, she intended not only to learn more about Solomon and his wisdom, but also perhaps to solidify the trade agreements between the nations there. It's important to note, and we'll talk more about this shortly, that there you might see the possible trail that she took overland, where the caravans had gone from Sheba up to Jerusalem, or perhaps on the Red Sea there on the water. We're going to talk about the establishment of the seaport of Ezion Geber. That will be on our next map, that Solomon made to assist in the trade. And we're going to learn more about that in a minute. But regardless, Queen of Sheba spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all of her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he couldn't explain to her. So besides hearing the wisdom of Solomon with her own ears, the Queen of Sheba saw the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and their apparel, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord. And all these things to her, they were just breathtaking to her. She had not seen anything like it before. It overwhelmed her to realize just the half hadn't been told about Solomon and all his glory and his wisdom. So let's look then in some of these other gifts, starting in verse 7 of 2 Chronicles 9. And this is Queen of Sheba telling Solomon, "Happy are your wives, happy are these your servants, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on his throne as king for the Lord your God, because your God loved Israel and would establish them forever. He has made you king over them, that you may execute justice and righteousness." Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. There were no spices such as those that the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Moreover, the servants of Hiram and the servants of Solomon, who brought gold from Ophir, brought algum wood and precious stones. And the king made from the algum wood supports for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, lyres also and harps for the singers. There never was seen the like of them before in the land of Judah. And King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked, besides what she had brought to the king. So she turned and went back to her own land with her servants. So, complimenting Solomon again, she realized how happy, or in some cases, we see that translated as blessed. Blessed are your servants. Blessed are your men and those who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. So it may not be made, this statement may not be made to praise Solomon's treatment of his servants, but it might be designed to say how blessed these people who were in Solomon's presence all the time were to hear his wisdom. They were subjected and they were in the presence of all this wisdom that he was telling them. And his wisdom was unusual because she realized his wisdom was from God. And he praised him. So the queen reasoned that if Solomon was divinely endowed with this wisdom, that God was certainly worthy of praise. So the queen, having seen his wisdom, having seen his wealth, she praised God, and she offered a tribute to the king. Verse 9, it states, "And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great abundance, and precious stones. There never were any spices such as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon." So her gifts were valuable, numerous. They were superior in quality. And at that time, these gifts of spices were more than any that had been made before, because it seems that in that time, Sheba had developed a great irrigation process and irrigation system where they could raise vast quantities of spices that were used for perfumes and incense. So a lot of those resources came out of Sheba because of their being able to irrigate and to raise these type of spices. So the gifts brought by the Queen of Sheba were not the only ones coming into Solomon's treasury at that time. His arrangement with King Hiram of Tyre, whose servants partnered, if you remember, partnered with Solomon's servants. Initially, they helped him build the temple. They had resources to assist in that. But they brought gold from Ophir. They brought algum wood and precious stones as well. So the algum wood, we don't know exactly what it translates to in today, but it was a very valuable wood, very desirable. They used it to build the temple, to build the palace. So, but that was very valuable at that time. This area that they were bringing the gold from was Ophir, and there's a question about where that actually was located. Some people say maybe one side or the other of the Red Sea there. There's actually some gold mines on the Egypt side, kind of more in Ethiopia side, that they suspect those resources came from. But anyway, nevertheless, Ophir is a question mark of where that actually came from. But the king used these supplies to make walkways of this wood for the house of the Lord, for the king's house. He made instruments using this wood as well. And this section concludes with Solomon giving to the Queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked, much more than she had brought to the king. So if she came to build a relationship with Solomon, she was very successful. Some people say her trip was to see his glory, see his wisdom. Other people say the trip was to establish a trade agreement with Israel and with Solomon because of the great wealth at that time. Or it could have been some of both. But nevertheless, at that time, because of all the trade, we see, even at the time of David, the trade that was controlled over land by David and now, as a result, controlled by Solomon. They were controlling a lot of these trade routes over land in the desert. But we don't think about, I don't, you may have studied this a lot. I don't think of Solomon having a navy, do you? Of having ships? Well, we see in 1 Kings chapter 9, King Solomon also built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath on the shore of the Red Sea. Then Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, seamen who knew the sea, to work with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and acquired 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. So when we think of what Solomon had done to enlarge his trade, he gave access with the Phoenicians' help, with the king of Tyre. And the Phoenicians at that time were the greatest sailors of the ancient world. They had a great overlapping range where they would trade. But in order to increase the trade, they helped Solomon build at Ezion-Geber this port. And what that would allow them to do then is by sea, leave from there close to Palestine and go hit all the east coast of Africa, Arabia, and points further east. Might have been India and even further. So there's some speculation about how far their actual trade went. But this gave them a really convenient way to connect those trade routes, to bring all this mass amount of goods and things that were tradable close to them. And from that point, then they would hit some of the overland trade routes. The Phoenicians, when they helped him build, here's a little diagram of perhaps what a Phoenician ship might have looked like. This is more likely the Phoenicians helped him build the boats. Some speculate from the Egyptian side, the Egyptians helped build it. But anyway, this is more of a Phoenician type pattern that an artist rendered. So with that, with those ships, he was able to connect and get those luxury items from East Africa and all points east. Then they would transfer that overland, and then that would benefit Phoenicia. So Phoenicia and the king of Tyre, this was another link in the trade chain where they could have all those goods and services, or all those goods coming through, porting it as Ezion-Geber, going over land, and then into Phoenicia, where they could expand that trade into the Mediterranean and even further west. So this was a key piece of not just Solomon, but also Phoenicia and king of Tyre, Hiram. So one of the terms of these ships is called fleet of ships of Tarshish. So these were large ships, seagoing, and it's said that once they departed, that once every 3 years they returned to port, probably moving very slowly from port to port as they made landfall and trading as they went. So they brought back all these goods of gold and silver. They brought back ivory. They brought back apes. Some think baboons, some think monkeys. Some they brought back other species that were identified as peacocks. So they're bringing back all these exotic things that people hadn't seen before in that area. But again, they're bringing all these things back, and it does benefit Phoenicia as well as they move those things west. So it's in this context of the trading and of the seagoing of Israel and of Solomon that the Queen of Sheba is visiting him. Now Sheba is, I don't know if it's on this slide or not. Uh-oh. I lost it. Can somebody help me in the booth? Sorry about that. Sheba, having been in that narrow spot in the Red Sea, they controlled a lot of the shipping lanes. Thank you. Shipping lanes that went there at the end of the Red Sea, out of the Arabian Sea. So this was Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon, perhaps not only because she was concerned about Sheba's influence on the trade and on the trade routes, because of what he had done in building the seaport at Evian Gezer, but also there also is the possibility that Solomon's trade with the Phoenicians, with King of Tyre, with Hiram, depended a lot on what Sheba was going to do and would allow to be done. So they're making these agreements that would allow all this trade to go back and forth. So it's we see also in history there's some people doubt that there was a queen at that time leading a nation of Sheba, but there are quite a few references in ancient literature where in Assyrian records that refer to the queens of Arabia in times that are a little later than this. So there's no doubt that the Queen of Sheba was this leader of the nation. Let me go to... Okay, I'll try not to go past that point. So again, that wealth that is coming in on these trade routes that it's too small to see colors, but down here on the east side of the Red Sea is where Ezion Geber was, which is labeled as Aqaba now, but that was the port. It connected with the overland route from Egypt, which is labeled as Memphis, and then from Ezion Geber went up north, and this was all called the King's Road. So this was a major trade route. Went from Egypt to the seaport, and then up the east side of the Jordan River through Damascus and all the way over to Rafah, which is in modern-day Syria. So that was one of the major trade routes at the time. There's a blue route that came out of Egypt from Memphis in this map and went along the coast, and that's called the Via Maris. And that also was another major route coming out of Egypt. So you can notice kind of how all those routes intersect and combine. And you can just imagine in your mind's eye these big camel caravans over land, or these ships as they went from port to port, and how they were trading all the goods and all the wealth that was going on at that time. So it gives a little more. In my mind's eye, I've never really focused on the fact that Solomon had all these ships or had help from Hiram, king of Tyre, in the navy, and to have all this trade over the oceans. But anyway, we see a lot of this access that King Solomon is acquiring from people coming to him, to giving him gifts, to seeing for themselves what his wisdom was, see all of his glory at that time. So let's read then in 2 Chronicles 9, starting in verse 13, and we're going to read the rest of our text from 13 through 28. And this is going to be talking about some more about his wealth. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that which the explorers and merchants brought. And all the kings of Arabia and the governors of the land brought gold and silver to Solomon. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of beaten gold went into each shield. And he made 300 shields of beaten verse 16. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold, 300 shekels of gold went into each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Verse 17, the king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps, and a footstool of gold, which were attached to the throne. And on each side of the seat were armrests, and 2 lions standing beside the armrests, while 12 lions stood there, one on each end of a step of the 6 steps. Nothing like it was ever made for any kingdom. So all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and of gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. And Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And he ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Cephala. And horses were imported for Solomon from Egypt and from all lands. So as we read this, we just see all of the wealth that he has. And every year this tribute was coming into him as king from the surrounding areas, from the surrounding kingdoms. It talks about the amount of gold collected. It's an immense amount, 666 talents. The old Hebrew, in Hebrew, the measurement for a talent was about 130 pounds. So you take 130 pounds times 666, you're looking at over 86,000 pounds of gold that were brought to him. It doesn't include what these traveling merchants and traders were bringing to him as well. So all these governors, all these kings from across the ancient world were bringing him gold and silver. And he used some of this gold to make shields, hammered shields, which you put in the house of the forest of Lebanon. He also made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. And we looked at the details in that in the text, which was just amazing. Nothing like that had been done before. So it was unknown previously of how all this wealth came together, more than any other kingdom. And his vessels were all gold. And it references here the house of the forest of Lebanon. We didn't really get into this when we talked about the palace and the temple. We talked a lot about the temple. But in his palace complex, there were 5 different buildings or areas in his building complex that we had talked about being adjacent to the temple, but we didn't get into the details. So there was the house of the forest of Lebanon was one area. The hall of pillars was another area. The throne room, a palace for Pharaoh's daughter, and a palace for Solomon. So it was there somewhere in the temple complex. The palace complex, and it was probably called the house of the forest of Lebanon because of the use of all the cedars that were in the building that he'd gotten from Hiram, king of Tyre. So it functioned as a storehouse, and Solomon also used it as an armory. So that was one of the places in the palace that is mentioned in this text. One of the other things that's mentioned toward the end is Solomon as a horse trader. So we've already seen that Solomon had added these chariot corps and cavalry units to his army. He had established these chariot cities that were used to defend the kingdom, to be able to strike out against any threats. But he became really a great horse breeder and horse trader. He imported his horses and chariots from Egypt, A lot of the chariots came from Egypt. A lot of the horses came from an area that's it's called Q, or in this, we might know it as Cilicia. It's kind of an area that's in the plains up in southern Asia Minor. More kind of area where we think on a map where Tarsus is or was, where the Apostle Paul was from. So they were well known for their horses. So the combination of the horses, the best in the land, the best in the world that they knew of at that time, the chariots being manufactured in Egypt, and all those things being imported for Solomon for his use. So we saw that David, and we talked about previously how David had controlled the overland trade routes. Now, besides that, we have all of the sea routes that Solomon is benefiting from. So when the Hebrews, just kind of wrapping up in that area, when the Hebrews asked for a king, they had no idea what changes were ahead of them. From basically the people living in the backwoods under the rule of Saul, when he became king, they became a dominant force under David and barely subsisting on agriculture. When Saul was king, they became this great trading nation under Solomon. They were once oppressed by the Philistines who were along the coast there, and now they are oppressing other nations in all directions. They are over them, and they are predominant over all of them. And religiously, we talked about the tabernacle being the worship place of God while they were wandering around in the wilderness, and all the way up to the time that the temple was built. So that became a more permanent structure. And in the process, though, Solomon starts to introduce these seeds of religious decay. And if we had time to continue, if you want to continue to read the story, we start getting into the divided kingdom. So this decay that is starting to creep in through Solomon's reign religiously, it becomes really Israel and Judah ceases to be a force, ceases to be that social and economic and religious force in the region because of their decay, and they'll start to have division in the kingdom. So, anybody have any comments? We've got some more things to talk about. I'll ask for some more feedback here in a second about some of these riches. But anybody have any comments at this point? Okay. So as we look at just what applications that might make to us, Jesus in Matthew 12 is referring to the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon to make a point of the people of his day that even as great as Solomon was, as grand as his kingdom was, that Jesus was even greater. Matthew 12 says, "The queen of the south will rise up in judgment with the generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed, and greater than Solomon is here." The second application is this wealth, just the amount of wealth that was gathered is staggering. And Solomon realized that wealth is not found, or that the meaning of life is not found in the wealth that one has. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, Solomon says, "Then I hated all my labor which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity." So Solomon's assessment is worthy for us to consider. Especially we note that shortly after this, all that wealth that was left to his son Rehoboam basically lost it all. He, within one generation, Rehoboam, we think of all this glory and these riches were lost. Rehoboam disobeyed the Lord, but he humbled himself. He avoided total destruction from the Lord, but Shishak, the king of Egypt, came in and took away all these riches that Solomon had amassed with the Lord's blessing. In 2 Chronicles chapter 12, starting in verse 7, when the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, the word of the Lord came to Shimei, and they humbled themselves. I will not destroy them, but I will grant them some deliverance. My wrath shall not be poured out on Jerusalem by the hand of Shishak. Nevertheless, they shall be servants to him, that they may know my service and the service of the kingdoms of the countries. So Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away the shields of gold that Solomon had made. So all these riches, but Solomon was very wise. He realized as he was doing this, we see in Proverbs several verses of wisdom he is sharing. Proverbs 11:4, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but judgment delivers from death. 11:28, whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a green leaf. Proverbs 22:1, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. Chapter 22, verse 4, the reward for humility and fear of the Lord is riches and honor and life. And Proverbs 27:24, for riches do not last forever, and does a crown endure to all generations? So finishing up kind of where we started this morning, Solomon's greatest achievement was not his fame, which continues even to this day, but it's a simple statement that he provides at the end of Ecclesiastes, concluding that life apart from God is meaningless. And he wrote, fear God, keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So if we remember Solomon for anything, even of all his wealth and fame and his wisdom, let's remember this information he's giving us, this admonition that he's giving to us at the end of Ecclesiastes is to fear God and keep his commandments. Is there anything, we covered a lot today. I'm sorry I didn't give you a lot of opportunity to comment. Anybody have any comments about just anything in general we've talked about? Anything about this information we found out about riches from Solomon and how he came to finally realize what was important? Okay, I guess we covered it. Thank you all so much for this quarter. And it's been a real pleasure to be with you. And hopefully you got something out of this study. I know I did as a teacher, and I really appreciate your interest, a lot of comments through the weeks, and I really appreciate being with you. Thank you.